So, first of all, I want to thank the Women's Foundation of Boston volunteer team, which was headed by this amazing young woman named Salix Nash, who came out of graduate school at Tufts and put this together, put the final touches, and really finalized this project that we've been working on since 2020 with several other volunteers. And they worked really hard over the last, I would say, 4 to 6 months to finalize this project. So shout out to them. Our board, just as a backdrop, our board of directors decided in 2021 that we really needed to create and finish this index. This index is exactly the index that we used from Indiana University that created the Women's Foundation of Boston. As you know, the Women's Foundation, we were funded in part due to the data from the Women's Philanthropy Institute at Indiana University, which at the time showed that only 1.6% of all philanthropic giving in our country was directed towards women and girls serving nonprofits. That was the data point that really shocked the co-founders and I, and kind of really triggered us to create the Women's Foundation of Boston. So we're hyper-focused on that data point. And our board decided that we really needed to create our own index. So we knew what was going on locally in Greater Boston in terms of charitable giving to women and girls serving nonprofits. So lo and behold, we have done this with our volunteer team, which is really quite amazing because the Women's Philanthropy Institute spends an enormous amount of time and resources on their index. Thank goodness. We're so grateful for it. But we have done this with volunteers, which I think is pretty impressive and really speaks to the ethos of the Women's Foundation of Boston and how much we get done with our professional volunteers. Next slide, please. So I'll discuss the significance of this project. Then I'm going to touch on the methodology and the findings, which I know you're all probably really focused on. And finally, I'll talk about the conclusions that we can draw from this work. Next slide, please. As you know, the Women's Foundation of Boston was founded in part due to this data, as I had mentioned earlier. This project was inspired by the National Giving Index from the Women's Philanthropy Institute at Indiana University. And we're really excited about this final creation of the Women and Girls Serving Index for Greater Boston. Learning the proportion of giving to women and girls serving nonprofits in Greater Boston region has both quantitative and qualitative implications, which will inform us, the Women's Foundation of Boston and leadership team, and will really help shape our future and show to our community the impact and importance of our work. So we're really excited about this. Next slide, please. On the quantitative front, the Women's Foundation of Boston is able to measure the proportion of giving to women and girls serving nonprofits in Greater Boston, which is the most significant indicator of changes over time in gender-focused philanthropic sector. So we also now have comparable statistics to the national number, which is produced by WPI, or the Women's Philanthropy Institute. We actually met directly with the engineer of their index to really drill down on how we should create this and make sure that it was accurate and in line with their model. This index can be used as a benchmark to be shared with other constituents in the philanthropic ecosystem. And finally, the Women's Foundation of Boston is able to use these findings to work on our goal setting, right? So where we want to move the needle and how we want to move the needle. And we'll be able to showcase that to our community on an annual basis. Next slide, please. So by sharing the results of this index, both within and outside the philanthropic community, we really feel and hope to inspire, right, more directed giving to nonprofits serving women and girls, whether it's through us or directly to them. So this in turn should lead to community and economic growth in this region. Because as you all know, by raising, by improving women's lives, the whole economic community improves. So this work also serves, frankly, as validation of of the Women's Foundation of Boston's theory of change and our long-term impact of economic empowerment on women and girls in the Greater Boston area. And it really will help us refine our long-term sort of strategic goals. So it really is pretty profound on us specifically, but also on our community. Next slide, please. So now that we understand why this matters so much, right, to us and to our community, I'm going to walk you through the methodology on the next slide, which some of you may find really interesting and some of you might find really boring. But for this project, we really needed two numbers, right? We needed the total giving or net assets for women and girls serving nonprofits in Greater Boston, and that of all nonprofits in the same region, right? So the numerator is giving to women and girls serving organizations. The numerator is, the denominator is giving to all organizations. So the Women's Foundation of Boston was offered a listing of all women and girls serving organizations in Massachusetts from the Women's Philanthropy Institute at Indiana University. This served as our foundation for this project. For the remaining nonprofits and to calculate the figures in our index, we used data from the IRS, containing information such as EIN numbers, names, addresses of all the nonprofits in Massachusetts, as well as all the information on the federal Form 990s, 990EZs, which were all filed during the 2018 to 2021 period. Using the zip codes and EIN numbers provided in the data sets we collected, we then found all contributions and net assets for the nonprofits based in the Greater Boston area, as well as that for organizations serving women and girls. Finally, we audited our findings for any significant missing gaps in the data, which I'll touch on in the next slide, which you can move to next slide, thanks. As with any project, we did face limitations, which are outlined here. The first is that the original compilation of nonprofits serving women and girls was provided to us from the Women's Philanthropy Institute in 2018. So the list most likely has changed by now, so that there's some inaccuracies there. Next, the IRS data sets contain information for nonprofits which filed in the calendar year specifically, not necessarily in their fiscal year. So there's a little difference in that. Finally, there are some gaps in the data which might have impacted the final results. But all of that said, we are these results are really directly in line with the limitations that face the Women's Philanthropy Institute or really any general index analysis. So we are very confident in these numbers. We're very proud of these numbers, and we feel like they are realistic and comparable to the national report. Next slide, please. The next few slides summarize our findings, which show different aspects of the index. So next slide. I'm going to start with the donations. So in 2021, the proportion of charitable giving to organizations serving women and girls was 2.16% of all total donations to all nonprofits in Greater Boston. So in total, roughly $28 billion was contributed to all nonprofits in Boston, Greater Boston, while about $612 million of that were donated specifically to women and girls serving nonprofits in the same region. As the Advisory Council knows, you should be proud to hear that roughly 0.1% of these contributions were through us. So we're already moving that needle. And that's really impressive, especially after we've only been granting for 4 years and fundraising for 4 years. So you'll see the results from the 2018 through 2020 in the bar chart on the bottom left-hand side. This shows a decline in the portion of giving to organizations serving women and girls over this period, unfortunately, from 1.91% to 1.77%. It's really exciting for me personally to see that after several years of decline, the proportion to women and girls serving nonprofits jumped in 2021. And we're really, really hopeful to see an even larger proportion increase in 2022. Next slide. So here we are looking at the actual number of nonprofits. So this isn't dollars, this is number of nonprofits in Greater Boston compared to those serving women and girls in the same region. So as you can see, in 2021, there were a total of 8,800 nonprofits in Greater Boston, 8,800. And of that, 368 were focused on women and girls. While the number of nonprofits fluctuated, the number of women and girls serving nonprofits has been decreasing over time, which is very, very concerning, although it did have an uptick in 2021. Next slide, please. In 2021, for Boston-based nonprofits, serving women and girls, the higher education category, this probably won't come as a surprise to you, led with roughly $181 million in charitable contributions. And this was followed by human services sector, about $159 million. It's important to note that the Women's Foundation of Boston falls under human services, that category. So we represented about 0.4% of these contributions. Next slide, please. Next, we look at similar indices for, but for net assets, which I think is super important. Shout back to my endowment discussion earlier. Net assets is super important because that's all about sustainability and future growth. And so similarly to donations, we found that about 2.53% of all net assets for all charitable organizations in Greater Boston are specific to women and girls serving nonprofits. And that's relative to a total of 6.7 trillion in net assets. It's really troubling to see that this index has been decreasing since 2018. The next slide, we'll see where those net assets are being housed. Next slide, please. As you can see, 85% of all net assets of the nonprofits serving women and girls in Greater Boston are held by higher education institutions. Wellesley College is a significant component, making up 43% of this total figure. And next slide, please. In this last portion of this presentation, I'll review our findings and draw a few conclusions, then leave some time for Q&A before wrapping up. So next slide. First, we found that Boston is in line with national statistics with respect to giving and charitable donations to women and girls. Women's Philanthropy Institute reported that in 2018, the proportion of giving to women and girls was 1.9%. In that same year, we found that Boston index was 1.91. Unfortunately, 2018 was the last year which we have on the national level because it takes Indiana University a couple years to do this because they have this giant database. So we're ahead of them in terms of numbers. But we feel confident in our results and which show an increase in that proportion in 2021. So we're hoping the national figures will show the same when they get to that year. Of the 8,800 nonprofits in Greater Boston, about 370 intentionally serve women and girls, and the largest area of contributions and net assets are in higher education. Next slide, please. What does this all mean for the Women's Foundation of Boston? Well, WFBoston now has a solid piece of data, right, to showcase to our community on exactly how much is being given to women and girls in Greater Boston. And we're going to be tracking this index annually. And as we continue to grow, this will show our impact on the local community. And we feel like this is super, super awesome for us and for our community and for all philanthropy. Because the more data we have, the more educational choices we can make, right? So if we don't know, we can't make decisions that are accurate. We will be sharing this index publicly. I am on a webinar with the executive director of the Women's Philanthropy Institute in early November. We are going to be actively discussing this. They are, by the way, the Women's Philanthropy Institute at Indiana University is thrilled that we created this based on their model, and they're hoping that this inspires other women's foundations all over the country to do the same. We are going to share this with our broader local and national community with a press release from our PR, our pro bono PR agency is putting that together as we speak. And we're going to share this with our community very shortly. We wanted to share it with our board, which we did last week, and with you all first. But we're really excited to get this out to the public. We think it's super impressive. We think it's very, very informative, and it will inspire people to consider giving to women and girls more. And of course, we'll be able to use this when we consider our goal setting and our long-term strategy at the Women's Foundation of Boston. So with that, I've said enough. I want to thank you all for making it through that slide and all those numbers.